Today is May 24, 2026, and the most important number that was published in the last several weeks is not the one that any headline about the Iran negotiations or the Hormuz tolls or the Senate War Powers vote is leading with. It is not the $2 million per ship that Iran's Persian Gulf Strait Authority is collecting in Bitcoin and Chinese yuan from vessels transiting the controlled maritime zone. It is not the $103 per barrel that Brent crude settled at on Friday after the diplomatic optimism of Trump's final stages comment and Rubio's some good signs calibration collided with the operational reality of Iran's decision to keep 440 kilograms of highly enriched uranium inside the country regardless of what any mediator in Tehran says. It is not the $1 trillion that the U.S. Congress has already approved for the Pentagon's 2026 budget as the Iran war enters its 85th day, costing Washington approximately $1 billion every 24 hours. The number is $2.887 trillion. That is the total global military expenditure recorded for 2025 by the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, published on April 27, 2026, representing the 11th consecutive year of global military spending increases and the highest share of global GDP devoted to military purposes since 2009. Global military spending as a share of GDP reached 2.5%. The highest level in 16 years, and the specific distribution of that $2.887 trillion across the world's military spenders is the document that tells you more precisely than any diplomatic communique or truth social post or oil price movement exactly where the global power structure is heading and what America's strategic position inside that structure will look like, not in 2030 but in 2027. Read the specific distribution with the full weight it carries. The United States spent $954 billion on its military in 2025. Its NATO allies in Europe and Canada combined spent $559 billion. Its treaty allies in Asia, Japan, South Korea, Australia, the Philippines, Thailand spent additional hundreds of billions, and when The Economist applied purchasing power adjustments to the raw spending figures, accounting for the fact that $1 of military spending buys different quantities of soldiers, weapons, and operational capability in different economies, it reached a conclusion that no peacetime analysis of American global power has been able to produce since the Cold War ended. America's allies now collectively outspend it in purchasing power-adjusted defense budgets for the first time in history. That is not an analytical projection, that is the documented arithmetic of the 2025 defense spending data that SIPRI and The Economist have both confirmed from independent methodological directions. The allies, taken together, are spending more on their militaries in real purchasing power terms than the country whose security guarantees they have built their entire defense architectures around for 80 years, and the specific reason that sentence matters for every war being planned, every alliance being recalculated, and every strategic decision being made in Beijing, Moscow, and Washington right now is not the spending number itself. It is what the spending number reveals about the transformation of the global military order that the number is the financial signature of. But let's back all the way up, because to understand why the $2.887 trillion global military spending figure published in April 2026 is the most strategically consequential single data point produced this year, more consequential than anything that has happened in the Strait of Hormuz, more consequential than the Beijing summit's first session outcome, more consequential than the Senate's war powers vote, you need to understand the specific historical context that makes the Allies outspending America in purchasing power not a financial curiosity but a structural transformation of the international system whose implications are only beginning to manifest in the operational decisions of every government that has been depending on American military power as the foundation of its security calculations. Here is where things stand as of May 24, 2026. The United States military budget of $954 billion in 2025 represents a 7.5% decline from 2024. That decline is the largest single-year percentage reduction in American military spending in over a decade. The primary driver is straightforward. No new financial military assistance for Ukraine was approved by Congress in 2025. In the 3 years preceding 2025, Congress approved a combined $127 billion in Ukrainian military assistance that counted toward American military expenditure. The removal of that specific line item from the 2025 budget produced the 7.5% decline that every government watching American military commitment is now incorporating into its strategic planning. Europe simultaneously went in the opposite direction. European military spending rose 14% in 2025 to $864 billion. That is the highest level SIPRI has ever recorded for Europe in the organization's entire data series. Germany increased military spending 24% year over year to $114 billion, exceeding NATO's 2% of GDP guideline for the first time since 1990, the year the Berlin Wall came down and Germany reunified under the assumption that the Russian military threat had receded permanently. That assumption governed German defense policy for 35 consecutive years. The 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine began dismantling the Trump administration's explicit signals about American commitment to European security accelerated the dismantling. The Iran war's demonstration that the United States has finite missile inventories that combat operations consume at rates that create supply chain delays for European partners completed the process. Spain increased military spending 50% to $40.2 billion, surpassing the NATO 2% of GDP threshold for the first time since the alliance adopted the benchmark in 1994. 32 years of Spanish military spending below the NATO guideline ended in a single year. The institutional momentum that produced 3 decades of Spanish underspending on defense did not change because of a policy debate or a diplomatic communique. It changed because the operational environment of 2025, Russia's ongoing war in Ukraine, Trump's demands that European allies take primary responsibility for European security, and the Iran war's demonstration of what a major military operation against a mid-tier adversary costs in missile inventories and operational tempo made the cost of underspending higher than the cost of spending. Now let's get into what the specific numbers reveal about China and Russia, because the $2.887 trillion total is not a story about European rearmament alone. It is a story about the simultaneous acceleration of military investment by every major power in the international system simultaneously, and the specific trajectory of that acceleration tells you something about the probability distribution of what the next decade of international competition looks like. China increased military spending 7.4% to an estimated $336 billion. The word estimated carries more analytical weight than any other word in that sentence. Beijing does not fully disclose its military spending. The SIPRI figure of $336 billion represents the Institute's best reconstruction of Chinese military expenditure from available data, but multiple independent analyses and intelligence community assessments have consistently suggested that China's actual military investment, accounting for off-budget spending, defense industrial subsidies, research and development investments that flow through civilian institutional channels, and the specific purchasing power advantage that Chinese defense procurement enjoys in a domestic economy where labor and manufacturing costs are substantially lower than American equivalents, may be significantly higher than the disclosed figure suggests. What the $336 billion figure represents with confidence is the direction of travel. China has increased military spending in every year for more than 2 decades without exception. The 7.4% increase in 2025 continues a trajectory that has transformed the People's Liberation Army from a regional ground force with limited power projection capability in 2000 to a genuinely global blue water navy with carrier aviation, nuclear ballistic missile submarine patrols, hypersonic weapons, space-based ISR architecture, and the specific anti-access area denial capability that American operational planners in the Indo-Pacific have been designing their force posture around for 15 years. The Hormuz confrontation in May 2026, when Chinese warships altered course toward an American carrier strike group for 30 minutes in the world's most contested energy waterway, is the operational expression of the strategic trajectory that $336 billion per year in military investment over 2 decades has produced. Russia spent $190 billion on its military in 2025, an increase of 5.9%, bringing its military burden to $7.5 Percent of GDP, the highest share of national economic output that Russia has devoted to military spending in its post-Soviet history. In 2025, military expenditure as a share of government spending reached the highest level ever recorded for Russia since the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. An economy whose GDP is smaller than Italy's is spending 7.5% of it on its military and sustaining a major land war in Ukraine simultaneously, funded in part by oil revenue that the Iran war's disruption of global energy markets has kept elevated well above the pre-conflict baseline. Every barrel of Russian crude that sells at $103 per barrel, rather than the pre-Iran war price below $75, is $28 of additional Russian defense revenue that the specific operational consequence of the Hormuz crisis is generating for the military that NATO's eastern flank is positioned to deter. Read that connection with the full weight it carries. The Iran war, which the United States initiated partly to prevent Iran from maintaining its leverage over global energy prices through Hormuz control, has simultaneously been generating elevated oil price revenue for Russia, the other major energy exporter whose military buildup is the primary driver of European rearmament that the elevated spending figures document. The operational and financial linkages between those two conflicts are not coincidental. They are the product of the specific structure of an energy market in which the disruption of any major transit corridor elevates prices globally and in which the countries whose fiscal foundations depend on those elevated prices are not the countries whose governments are seeking to resolve the disruption. Now let's talk about what NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte's statement that anyone who thinks Europe can defend itself without the United States should keep dreaming actually means in the context of the spending figures that are now publicly documented, because Rutte's keep dreaming formulation has been analyzed primarily as a political statement about European capabilities, and the political analysis is correct as far as it goes, but the spending figures reveal the specific dimension of Rutte's assessment that political analysis alone does not capture. Rutte said that without American military support, European nations would need to spend approximately 10% of their GDP on defense to replicate the capabilities that American NATO membership provides. The European NATO members spent a combined $559 billion in 2025 at a weighted average of roughly 2.1% of GDP. 10% of European NATO member GDP would represent approximately $2.7 trillion in annual European defense spending. The gap between what Europe is spending and what independence from American security guarantees would cost is not measured in percentage points. It is measured in multiples. Europe would need to roughly quintuple its current defense spending to achieve the security outcome that American membership in NATO currently provides. The nuclear dimension alone makes that calculation almost certainly permanently prohibitive. For any timeline shorter than several decades, building an independent European nuclear deterrent capable of replacing the American nuclear umbrella that Rutte described as the ultimate guarantor of European freedom would require not just spending but the specific industrial, scientific, and weapons design infrastructure that only France and the United Kingdom currently possess in Europe, and their combined nuclear arsenals represent a fraction of the American capability they would need to replace. But the specific detail in the spending figures that Rutte's keep dreaming formulation does not fully capture is the Iran war dimension. Europe's reliance on US weapon systems is under strain in the wake of the Department of Defense expending substantial numbers of expensive missiles during the Iran war. According to Breaking Defense's analysis of the SIPRI data, the specific operational consequence is that US-made weapon systems heading to Baltic and Scandinavian NATO nations are facing delays directly caused by the Iran war. According to Reuters, citing unnamed sources, the missiles that the United States has been firing in the Hormuz theater since February 28 are the same categories of missiles that NATO's eastern flank depends on for the air defense architecture that deters Russian escalation against the Baltic states, Poland, and other exposed NATO members. This is the specific strategic linkage that the $2.887 trillion spending figure's internal distribution reveals and that Rutte's keep dreaming statement does not explicitly address. The Iran war is not just consuming American military resources in the Persian Gulf, it is simultaneously creating the supply chain delays that reduce the American military capability available for the European theater, increasing Russian oil revenue that funds the Russian military buildup that makes European rearmament necessary, and demonstrating to every government watching that American military resources are finite in ways that the post-Cold War era of American military dominance allowed governments to discount. Now let's get into the specific implications for America's strategic position in 2026 and beyond, because the Allies surpassing American military spending in purchasing power terms for the first time in history is not primarily a story about what allies are doing, it is primarily a story about what America's strategic position requires, what the current trajectory of American military spending is producing, and what the specific gap between those two realities means for the global order that American military power has been the primary guarantor of since 1945. The United States-Iran war is costing approximately $1 billion per day according to multiple official and semi-official assessments. Congress has already approved more than $1 trillion in defense spending for 2026. The Trump administration is proposing $1.5 trillion for 2027. The Pentagon has announced 3 framework agreements to accelerate production of precision strike missiles, THAAD interceptors, and missile components to rebuild stockpiles that Iran war operations have depleted. Every missile fired at an Iranian target, every intercepted Iranian drone, every sortie over the Strait of Hormuz is a consumption event in the specific inventory that the American military maintains. For its global force posture requirements across every theater simultaneously, the $1.5 trillion proposed for 2027 is the acknowledgement that the Iran war's operational tempo has revealed a consumption rate for precision munitions that the existing industrial base cannot sustain without a significant expansion of production capacity. The 3 framework agreements for missile component production are the specific procurement response to the specific operational lesson that 85 days of combat operations in the Hormuz theater have produced. American military power is consumable, the rate of consumption in a sustained combat operation against a mid-tier adversary with a dense air defense environment and a large drone inventory is higher than the pre-conflict production rate of the industrial base was calibrated to sustain. China's military planners are the most attentive readers of that specific lesson. The $336 billion that China spends on its military in 2025 is allocated in part against the specific operational problem of what a sustained US military campaign in the Western Pacific would consume in American precision munitions inventories over a 30, 60, or 90-day operational timeline. The Hormuz theater is providing a live demonstration of the answer and every analysis that Chinese military planners are producing of the Iran war's operational record is a data point in the specific modeling of how long American military operations in the Taiwan Strait scenario would remain at their initial intensity before the consumption curve created operational constraints on the American side that a conflict's continuation exploited. Russia's military planners are reading the same lesson from the same data set but applying it to the European theater. The 7.5% decline in American military spending in 2025, the weapon system supply delays to Baltic and Scandinavian partners, the missile inventory consumption in the Hormuz theater, and the $1.5 trillion proposed for 2027 as the recovery budget. All of these are data points in the Russian military's continuous assessment of the window during which the American military's European theater posture is at its most constrained by the Iran war's competing demands. Now let's be precise about what the spending trajectory means for the next 3 years, because the $2.887 trillion 2025 global military spending figure is not the peak of the current rearmament cycle. SIPRI's researchers stated explicitly that given the range of current crises and the long-term military spending targets of many states, this growth will probably continue through 2026 and beyond. The specific targets that are already committed to confirm the growth projection: NATO members have committed to a long-term goal of 5% of GDP on defense by 2035. The European Union's Rearm Europe plan provides €150 billion in loan financing to accelerate European defense investment. Germany's defense budget trajectory from $114 billion in 2025 to a projected figure that its current commitment implies will bring it close to or above $150 billion by 2027. China's unbroken 2-decade trajectory of 7 to 8% Annual military spending increases applied to a $336 billion 2025 base produces a 2030 Chinese military budget approaching $500 billion before purchasing power adjustment. The specific convergence that those trajectories describe is a global military spending environment in which every major power and every major alliance is simultaneously increasing its military investment at the fastest rate in decades, driven by the simultaneous presence of an active war in the Hormuz theater, an ongoing war in Ukraine, an accelerating Chinese military buildup aimed at Taiwan scenario capabilities, and a North Korean weapons program producing operational ballistic missiles at a rate that South Korea and Japan's defense establishments are treating as the defining near-term security challenge of Northeast Asia. The world is arming, not in the cautious incremental way of the 2010s when European governments debated whether to reach 2% of GDP and consistently failed to do so, while American military spending absorbed the burden of global security provision in the accelerated, unprecedented, emergency-driven way of governments that have concluded that the operational environment they face requires military capabilities they do not currently possess and cannot acquire on a comfortable timeline. Here is the honest assessment of what America's strategic position looks like inside the spending figures that the 2025 data documents. The United States remains the world's largest military spender at $954 billion. Its Iran war is consuming precision munitions at a rate that is creating supply chain delays for allied partners in Europe. Its proposed 2027 budget of $1.5 trillion is the specific financial commitment to recovering from that consumption while simultaneously funding the Indo-Pacific force posture that China's $336 billion in accelerating military investment requires. Its allies are spending more in purchasing power terms than it is for the first time in history, which represents the realization of Trump's long-standing demand that European and Asian partners shoulder more of the burden of their own security, and its NATO Secretary General is telling European lawmakers that keep dreaming is the appropriate response to anyone who thinks the increased European spending can substitute for American military capability. Those four simultaneous facts describe the specific strategic moment in which America's global military position currently exists: more allied spending than at any point in history, more American military consumption from active combat than at any point since the Gulf War, more Chinese and Russian investment in the specific capabilities designed to challenge American operational freedom in the theaters where American interests are most concentrated, and more global military spending in total than at any point since SIPRI began tracking the data. 2.887 trillion, 11 consecutive years of increases, the highest share of global GDP devoted to military purpose since 2009, America's allies outspending it for the first time, China approaching $336 billion and accelerating, Russia at 7.5% of GDP and funding itself on Hormuz crisis oil revenue, Germany spending more than at any point since 1990, Spain increasing 50% in a single year, and the Iran war consuming the American military's precision munitions inventory at a rate that the proposed $1.5 trillion 2027 budget is specifically designed to address. The world is not moving toward the order that American military dominance has sustained since 1945. It is moving away from it at a pace that the 2025 spending figures document with a precision that diplomatic communiques and summit outcomes and truth social posts cannot alter. The question that the trajectory answers is not whether the transition is happening, it is how fast it is happening and whether the specific decisions being made in Washington, Brussels, Beijing, and Moscow in the current operational environment of the Iran war, the Ukraine war, and the Taiwan Strait competition are accelerating the transition or managing it toward an outcome that the international system can absorb without the specific kind of major power conflict that the last time global military spending reached these levels as a share of GDP preceded. The last time it was this high was 2009, the time before that was the Cold War. The pattern that connects those data points is not reassuring. The spending figures are the financial signature of governments that have concluded they need more military capability than they currently possess. Governments that reach that conclusion simultaneously are not doing so in a diplomatic environment that makes their conclusions unnecessary. They are doing so because the operational environment they face has convinced them that the conclusion is correct. Watch the 2026 spending figures when SIPRI publishes them next April. Watch whether the Iran war's resolution produces a reduction in American military spending or whether the $1.5 trillion Trump budget proposal for 2027 establishes a new American military spending baseline that the post-Iran war environment sustains. Watch whether China's military spending acceleration continues its two-decade trajectory or whether the Beijing summit's diplomatic outcomes produce a U.S.-China strategic framework that moderates the specific competitive dynamic that $336 billion per year in Chinese military investment represents, and watch whether Russia's 7.5% of GDP military burden, the highest since the Soviet Union fell, is sustainable on the oil revenue that the Hormuz crisis has been generating or whether the Iran war's resolution produces the oil price decline that compresses the Russian defense budget the same way lower oil prices constrained it in previous periods of Russian military ambition. 2.887 trillion, the 11th consecutive year, the Allies outspending America for the first time, the world is arming, and the specific arithmetic of who is arming how fast against whom tells you more about where this decade ends than anything being negotiated in Tehran or Beijing or the Senate chamber in Washington right now. Stay informed, stay ahead.